Yo, what's good? It's Carrie the Snail, live from H-Mart. But we're actually going to be talking about books. Bet you didn't think we'd be talking about books in H-Mart now, did ya? Yeah, well, today's the day. This year, I'm reading every #1 best-selling fiction and non-fiction book at Portland's best bookstore on the planet, Powell's Books. Today, we're talking about the #1 in non-fiction of December, Crying in H-Mart by Michelle Zauner, lead singer of Japanese Breakfast. What? Who said that? This was a very compelling memoir that follows Michelle losing her mother to cancer. And there were 3 profound ideas that I took away from this book: the culture you come from, loss, and food. You see that? Those are the vibes we got coming up for today, all right? So if you're not prepared for this kind of energy, get the frick out of the store, okay? Whoa, nah, it's okay. You can stay, I guess. Crying is healthy, even in public, sometimes. A bit of disclaimer for this book in particular. This is a memoir, which will dictate 2 things as I discuss this book. 1, I'm actually going to spoil this book, and I don't really think that should matter all that much. There are some really important ideas here that I think need to be discussed in full, and that shouldn't keep you from reading this person's full memoir if you're interested in it. I will never be able to tell you her story like she does. 2, while the initial conflict, you can say, of Michelle's story is her mother's battle with cancer, I'm actually going to be talking less about the battle with cancer itself and more about the way that this experience had brought up a lot of really interesting questions regarding identity. This is clearly a story about grief and loss, and I do not want to ignore that at all, but I think what's carried in its wake are some really profound insights that I want to talk about. This is a book that really showed me a lot about my Asian American heritage that I haven't really been able to put into words before. And so I'm really glad that I came across this book. I really didn't expect for it to be as thought-provoking as it was, but that's the beauty of reading something you didn't choose and why I did this challenge this year, so I could be surprised and learn things that I didn't expect to. Well, are we ready to engage those tear ducts in public? Because it's time to have an emotional breakdown next to this crab over here. Okay. First, I just want to get something out of the way. My main focus isn't going to be on the technical aspects about this book, but I am going to say right now that this book is in fact well written. As I mentioned before, Michelle Zauner is frontwoman of her music project, Japanese Breakfast. Good old Jay Brecky. Be Sweet off her album Jubilee was like one of my top 5 favorite songs of 2021. In fact, her debut album came from a lot of what happened in this story, and the cover of it features a picture of her mother. Anyway, all that to say is that she knows her way around some pen game. So naturally, this book is crafted with some really captivating prose. Rosy snapshots of memories with her mother. There are scenes at the dinner table lush with Korean food, but also some really emotionally raw moments too as her mother starts declining in health. Not only are these just compelling moments you can get lost in, but the ways she delivers and sequences these stories are also really fun and engaging. Most of the book is written in this sort of like stream of consciousness kind of vibe to lay the context of her background and family dynamics. Then when we get the diagnosis of her mother's colon cancer, the writing takes more of a linear transition. It feels like the writing really doesn't waste time at all and takes use of every single chapter, memory, and story. It made it really easy to get invested in quickly. All right, let's move on. I just had to get that out of the way real quick. If there are 3 specific ideas that I took away from this book, it's the culture you come from, loss, and food. Let's start with food. Ever since my mom died, I cry in H-Mart. H-Mart is freedom from the single-aisle ethnic section in regular grocery stores. She then goes on to paint the picture of how her Korean mother was the wellspring of culture for her. Growing up in America with a Caucasian father and a Korean mother, I relied on my mom for access to our Korean heritage. Michelle needed her mother to connect her to her Korean heritage. And this brings us back to why she's crying in H-Mart. Sobbing near the dry goods, asking myself, am I even Korean anymore if there's no one left to call and ask which brand of seaweed we used to buy? Because Michelle lost her mother, she didn't only lose her mother, she lost her connection to her culture, her heritage. Am I even Korean anymore? Food is a foundational part of cultural identity. There, I said it, and that's all I'm gonna say. Because I know there are dozens and dozens of Netflix documentaries with just perfectly captured food, with a voiceover that describes how every ingredient taken from the land is a molecule in this package that forms and builds your very being, and how every family member who sits with you around the table is like every ingredient in the dish of your life. I don't gotta explain that to you. There is an obvious necessity of food that gives you the sustenance you need, the nutrients you need, but there is also also a component of fostering community that food has as well. In centuries past, you couldn't make a well-rounded meal by yourself. Someone had to harvest the crops, perhaps slaughter an animal, pick the grains, knead the dough, and then prepare and cook all of it. Creating food was a communal experience, and therefore eating is a communal experience. At least it should be. It is therefore a lived experience that has so much of your identity between you, your community, your family within it. But there is another component to the experience of food that we might not always think about, but is embedded within our culture, and that is how you eat the food. So I'm half white and half Filipino. And one thing that I noticed from my dad, who is the Filipino one, is that there was a great importance in the way that you eat food. I remember as a kid how my dad meticulously walked me through how to break down and eat a crab. You crack the shell, but you don't smash it. You gotta keep that meat juicy and whole. You carefully remove the meat so it's all in one piece. And you better believe you're dunking that in some butter, some lemon. Oh, don't even get me started. He always taught me to try things. Eating food was a very interactive experience with me and my dad. And I'm sure this is true for a lot of cultures. Food is not only treated as a foundational way for families to come together, but in a way, it's kind of a skill to master. Michelle describes this same phenomenon when, as a child, her mom and her aunts were eating live octopus tentacles. And Michelle felt a sense of pride that she could eat her culture's food without fear. Eager to please my mother and impress my aunts, I balanced the liveliest leg I could find between my chopsticks, dipped it into the sauce as my mother had, and slipped it into my mouth. It was briny, tart, and sweet with just a hint of spice from the sauce, and very, very chewy. I gnashed the tentacle between my teeth as many times as I could before swallowing, afraid it would suction itself to my tonsils on the way down. "Good job," my aunts exclaimed. "That's our pretty girl." As a child, she felt identity, courage, and a sense of being through her experience with food around her family. I certainly felt this way between me and my dad, too. When I finally stopped annihilating that crab leg and started doing it right, my dad was really proud of me. And that made me feel really grown up, capable, and filled with pride. In a way, it's kind of like a small rite of passage, and I will never forget that. While Michelle had this intimate bond with her mother growing up, she then became more and more distant with her in her teen years. Their personalities and understanding of each other really started to skew and get lost as Michelle grew up more and had more autonomy. They constantly fought, even literally too. There was an instance where they tackled each other and took things to the ground. It's crazy. This period in her life not only demonstrated a separation between her and her mother, but in a subtle way between her and her culture. Eventually, in the late to post-college era, they started to rebuild their relationship a bit more. It wasn't perfect, but there was definitely something there. My mother had struggled to understand me, just as I struggled to understand her. Thrown as we were on opposite sides of a fault line, generational, cultural, linguistic, we wandered lost without a reference point, each of us unintelligible to the other's expectations. And then as she reflects as the writer, thinking about all these events in hindsight, she says, "Then what would have been the most fruitful years of understanding were cut violently short, and I was left alone to decipher the secrets of inheritance without its key." Unfortunately, it wasn't long into this stage of life when Michelle's mother, Chong Mi, was diagnosed with colon cancer. Naturally, this was devastating, but also met with a bit of denial. They go to doctor's appointments, try to figure out the next steps. Chong Mi does try some chemo for a little bit, and while it had some mild results, she ultimately decides that she doesn't want to follow through with chemo. She would rather spend her time with her family. So now Chong Mi is bedridden and at home. Michelle and her father are taking care of her full time, but it was obviously a lot of work. So they decide to bring in a Korean friend of Chong Mi's named Kai. Because Kai was Korean, she was able to relate to Chong Mi pretty closely. After a while, though, Michelle starts to notice that Kai is kind of being a little bit possessive over her mother. Kai speaks to Chong Mi strictly in Korean and ends up leaving Michelle out. Kai also starts inserting herself in more ways, making more decisions because she's the Korean one. She understands what Chong Mi would want, as if priding herself on being the most Korean person in the household and therefore the most equipped to take care of Chong Mi. She knows what food she wants, what things to bond over. And despite how alert and attentive is Michelle for her mother right now, it ends up putting her in this really bizarre situation where she kind of feels challenged, as if she's being pushed out because she's not Korean enough. Kai squinted at me like a smudge on a lens. She let out a soft scoff. "This is how we eat this one in Korea." My mother sat silently beside her like an obedient pet. What a cruel twist of fate, I thought. I had spent my adolescence trying to blend in with my peers in suburban America and had come of age feeling like my belonging was something to prove, something that was always in the hands of other people to be given and never my own to take. I can never be of both worlds, only half in and half out, waiting to be ejected at will by someone with greater claim than me, someone full, someone whole. For a long time, I tried to belong in America, wanted and wished for it more than anything. But in that moment, all I wanted was to be accepted as a Korean by two people who refused to claim me. You are not one of us, Kai seemed to say, and you will never really understand what it is she needs, no matter how perfect you try to be. This experience with Kai is a direct challenge to Michelle's Korean identity, as if it was some final test that she was failing. Am I even Korean enough to take care of my mother? This leads me to something else I want to discuss, which is this complex tension that second-generation immigrants experience. If you're not familiar, a second-gen immigrant is, in this case, someone who was born in America when their parent or parents were immigrants born in their home country. So they are now a generation removed from their culture because they weren't born in their parents' country of origin. They may retain some of their cultural background through their parents, but it is now shared with American culture. Now, this is a very complex subject, and I'm not really going to dive into it too deeply, but I bring this up because I want to point out some of Michelle's experiences as well as some of mine. There is a complex tension that second gens have, which is the want to hold on to your culture, but simultaneously wanting to assimilate to American culture because of internal but often external pressures. It leaves second gens in this weird no man's land of cultural identity. Michelle shares this very experience as she went to school in Eugene, Oregon, which was mostly all white except for her. Because she stood out, she naturally wanted to hide and get away from her cultural upbringing, for it to disappear from her so she wouldn't stand out more. And so now, years later, growing up with that tension, it has come to a head with Kai, who again is this direct challenge to her identity. The only thing that Michelle feels like she can offer her mother is to cook food for her, make the food that they used to share together, because that was a place where they could see eye to eye. I wondered if I should try to explain how important it was to me that cooking my mother's food had come to represent an absolute role reversal, a role I was meant to fill. That food was an unspoken language between us, that it had come to symbolize our return to each other, our bonding, our common ground. But I was so grateful for Kai's help that I didn't want to bother her. This dynamic really struck me because I think it distills this tension that second gens feel in a very tangible way with this sort of villain that has been created through Kai. And I saw myself with Michelle in a lot of ways in this. My dad is fully Filipino, my mom's Canadian. At a young age, my parents divorced, and I grew up with my mom. I was fortunate enough to have a good relationship with my dad, so I would see him every so often. But I started to notice something as I got older when I would see my Filipino sides of the family. I didn't feel Filipino that much. Whatever that was, I didn't think I had that. And this is no shade to my mom at all, but I didn't really grow up with that Filipino culture in my home. And so when I would be at family reunions, I often felt out of place, as if I didn't fully belong there. Even though a lot of my cousins are half Filipino as well, I felt like an outsider because in this case, my cultural tie was my father, and he wasn't in my house anymore. So to this day, I often feel like I'm in this cultural no man's land. And for a long time, I didn't know why I felt out of place. But I think Michelle, through this really interesting story, put to words this experience for me that was just under the surface. You know one area where I didn't feel like the outsider though? Food. Give me some of that chicken adobo. Give me a gallon scoop of that rice, please. If I do not have at least 26 pieces of lumpia on my plate, there was something wrong. Breaking bread with my cousins and family is when I felt the most at home. Is when I was able to forget about that outsider feeling and truly commune with them through this experience of food. My dad taught me how to eat seafood, how to eat lechon, what you dip this and that into. That is something I knew in an area where I didn't feel like I had to earn anything. At a certain point during the cancer, Michelle and her mother had become a little uncomfortable about the way that Kai was treating her. And so they told Kai to go home, and Michelle and Changmi were able to just be together. Unfortunately, the effect of the cancer was swift. The decline was devastating and eventually ends. Michelle goes through familiar stages of grief, along with the inevitable emotions and feelings that come like a wave after such a loss. After time where the dust was able to settle a little bit, a drive emerged within Michelle to start cooking food again. She looks for recipes on YouTube of the kind of stuff her mother would make, but had never attempted it before. And this stokes the fire of this strong urge to reconnect to her mother through the cooking of food, as if to actively reclaim that part of her culture, now that she's gone. Then something really interesting happens. Michelle stumbles across her mother's kimchi fridge that had been out of commission and stored away for months. And if you're not familiar, this is a smaller fridge dedicated to the fermentation of kimchi, because it's often very potent and made in large quantities. So Michelle comes across this out of commission fridge and opens it up, hoping to smell the kimchi that her mother would ferment. But then she notices something in one of the fridge cabinets. She looks inside to find hundreds of family photos that must have haphazardly been stored there during the move. She starts sifting through them and finds everything from significant family events to impromptu camera misfires where Changmi's eyes were both closed and clearly not prepared for the photo. As she starts to reflect on this experience of finding these photos in the kimchi fridge, she makes this really incredible connection that I want to read for you. Now that she was gone, there was no one left to ask about these things. The knowledge left unrecorded died with her. What remained were documents and my memories. And now it was up to me to make sense of myself, aided by the signs she left behind. How cyclical and bittersweet for a child to retrace the image of their mother, for a subject to turn back to document their archivist. I had thought fermentation was controlled death. Left alone, a head of cabbage molds and decomposes. It becomes rotten and edible. But when brined and stored, the course of its decay is altered. Sugars are broken down to produce lactic acid, which protects it from spoiling. Carbon dioxide is released and the brine acidifies. It ages, its color and texture transmute. Its flavor becomes tartar and more pungent. It exists in time and transforms. It is not quite controlled death because it enjoys a new life altogether. The memories I had stored I could not let fester, could not let trauma infiltrate and spread to spoil and render them useless. They were moments to be tended. The culture we share was active, effervescent in my gut and in my genes, and I had to seize it, foster it so it did not die in me, so that I could pass it on someday. The lessons she imparted, the proof of her life lived on in me, in my every move and deed. I was what she left behind. If I could not be with my mother, I would be her. I imagine that when you experience loss like this, it's so difficult not to see beyond it just being loss. It is devastating to lose somebody as beautiful and strong as Changmi. But what I think is the true loss is if Michelle lets these qualities and life lessons that she's taken from her mother die within her. Just because her mother is gone doesn't mean that the wisdom and love that she received from her mother is gone as well. Changmi was an archivist for Michelle, the one documenting the subject. Now in this role reversal, Michelle is documenting the archivist. And this is through Michelle's life. Michelle is now the snapshot of her mother. And so to carry on that life that Changmi lived, she has to embody that. I think that last line is so important. If I could not be with my mother, then I must be her. And I understand that to be the embodiment of something passed down to you. I think there is a responsibility that we have as sons and daughters to uphold that, to take and leave the good and bad things that we've inherited from our parents. They are a connection to a culture and a life that has come before us, and it is our responsibility to embody that as we raise the next generation and impart that on them as well. I had the realization this year, even before reading this book, which was interesting, that in order to intentionally cross this separation I feel that I have with my Filipino culture, I should make the food that I grew up having, the food that I loved. I've been paying attention to the power of family recipes. I know that may sound kind of silly, but I think family recipes, food that has been meticulously crafted and perfected for generations to be passed down, is an incredible thing. And I think I realized that it was my time to start participating in that. Even though I didn't grow up with my father in my home, some of my most favorite memories of him are through food. And I want to be able to share in that experience with my children one day. Maybe teach them how to eat a crab, you know? You hear that, bud? One day I'm gonna birth some children and they're gonna freaking eat you. Thank you so much for joining me in this weekly cry sesh at H-Mart. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. I make videos where I think and discuss the things that I consume. Huh? Yeah, you see how that ties into today's theme? Also, you know what's crazy? This H-Mart I went in had this like security camera wanted poster of this woman, and it said, "Please don't vomit," on the merchandise. And they had her photo up so I can shame her for doing that. Hey, well, you know, crying in H-Mart isn't the only thing people are doing in H-Mart. Shop safe out there, everyone.